So welcome to Ultramarker. This is an application that can be used to assess student work in a university or college or school setting. And when you install it, you can install it with an example module and example assessment. And I'm going to talk about how to use it and some of the features. Now, the first thing that you'll need to do is to make sure that you set up your institution. I'm going to leave it with the default one for this example at the moment, which is just a fictitious university. Then you go to the Unit tab or Module tab. Now this is where you define your module of study or your subject. So the first thing you need is to make sure you've got your institution name, the module or unit or subject title, and then you'll need a module or unit code, usually a level, and a pass mark you'll need to define, well, what will be the percentage at which your students will pass this particular module. You'll need a unit or module leader, and you could also put in your tutors in here as well that are going to teach on this module. And there's an optional feature to upload a unit leader or module leader signature file. You will need to define a unit folder or module folder, and the default, especially with this example, is in the C:\Ultramarker folder, and the actual module unit folder is again example within that folder. You also need a student marks folder where you're going to put the marked student work, and that would be in a folder called marks, which is a subfolder from in this case the example folder. You can also use an optional comma separated variable file in which you can upload student names and email addresses. Now when you can also access an optional unit peer review template file, and so this is where if you define a new assessment, you might want to get your colleagues to look at it before you give it to students to make sure it meets all the expected standards. And also the same thing of the moderation. Once you've marked your student work, you might want to get a colleague to look at that work to make sure it meets the standards again. And the same thing when you're getting your external examiners or other moderators, external moderators, to look at the work as well. So that defines your module of study or your unit of study. Now the next thing we'll move on to is the Grades tab. Now you'll need to define your grading schema. So all institutions should have a grading schema. So it may be different to this one. You may have, say, like for A grades, maybe A+, A minus, B+, B, B minus, or it might be some other sort of descriptive or numeric sort of grading schema. But you can define it in here. You don't need to use this one. You can define your own. You'll need a grade title. In this case, if you look at B2, we've got a grade title of B2. You might have some generic feedback which might be defined for your institution, which defines that grade. And you need a percentage equivalent. And because we're calculating an overall mark, we'll need to define, and if we want to give those marks as a grade, then we'll need to define what the lower grade boundary will be. What is accepted in this case is a B2 grade and an upper grade boundary. So between 64 and 66, that would define a B2, which is equivalent to 65% in this case. You can see you can select single or dual grades. We won't worry about dual grades this time. That's a more advanced feature. The next thing we need to go is to look at learning outcomes. These are optional, so you can define your own learning outcomes. These are the learning outcomes. This is what we expect our students to achieve from our subject or module. So obviously you should really have some learning outcomes. So let's have a look at the assessment tab. Now for an assessment we can define any type of assessment. This could be in this case the example is a presentation, but it could be a report, it could be some form of coursework, lab work, assignment, any type of assessment that we care to give our students can be assessed by Ultramarker. So we need to define a title. So we look at the description. You can see we've got an assessment title. We've got an assessment number or code. We've got a weighting within this subject or module, because obviously we may have more than one assessment, so we can say that this is worth, say, 30% in this case, so there's some other piece of work that makes up the other 70%, another assessment. We then need to give a description of the assessment. So what are we expecting our students to produce in order to satisfy this particular assessment? So what are we asking them to hand in or present in this case? Then we've got our assessment criteria. So I've got 5 individual criterion in this case, and because I've got 5, I've weighted each equally, so each is worth about 20%. They're worth 20% each. I've got my learning outcomes produced. They've been obviously reproduced from my learning outcomes tab. I've got my grades from the grades tab as well. This is my grading schema. For each criterion, I need to give a full description of what we're expecting students to produce for that particular individual criterion. So for each of them. Then for each grade, we then need to give a criteria. So what are we expecting? So if students have given us some very good work, but it's not professional, it's not excellent, for example, then obviously we're saying that that's worth a B grade of some sort, a B2 perhaps. We've decided it's worth a B grade. So we might say if it's professional work or it's excellent work, it's an A grade. Good work is just a C grade. Satisfactory is a D grade. And obviously if it's poor, it's a fail grade. So we need to obviously define the criteria to achieve each of those grades in our grading schema for each of our criterion. Now optionally we may also want to give, this is an optional thing, we might want to give feedback for improvement. So if we got if we award an A1, there will be room for probably no improvement. But if we got a B grade, there might be obviously some room for improvements. We might suggest how the students could improve. So that's something that we could do for each of our criterion and each of our grades within that criterion. So once we've defined our assessment rubric, we're ready to assess our students. So if we switch from the current mode of edit criteria mode and we go over to marking mode, I'll now put in a student name. Just use the generic name test at the moment. If they already exist, I can preload the work. Now for each of my criterion, I want to obviously determine what mark I'm going to give them according to my criteria to achieve that grade. So if I decide that what is your topic about is worth a B2 because it's good work, I'll just double click and award them a B2, and I award a mark for each of my grades, for each of my criterion, until I've awarded a mark for each of my criteria. So the other thing I might want to do for each of my criterion is to actually add a comment. Now I can obviously type in comments manually. The other thing I can do is if I double click in this empty box here, I can actually I've preloaded some comments from a file. I can predefine these comments. So for example, if I decide that the topic and client's needs are unclear, for example, I can actually add that and it will take this and put it into my comments. So obviously students usually make common mistakes, so it makes sense if you have instead of keep writing the same thing in for a number of students, if you've got these predefined comments, you can just add those comments in to each of your particular criteria. You can do those for each of your criterion and just insert them. Now you can also add a comment in for the overall work. So general comments for the work as a whole. So you might give some overall feedback on that. So once you've assessed your student, you can save the assessment. and it will give you a percentage. Then if you hit the report button, it will then give you a report. Now if you scroll down the report, you can see that it gives you the grade for each of your criteria, and it also gives you an overall grade, and then you can save that, and you can obviously give that to the student, or you can give it to and also give it to the moderator as well, that's going to moderate the work to see how you've assessed the work. So this could be very useful, because this report gives feedback to the student. It tells them, how well they've performed on each particular of the criterion within the assessment, and overall as well. And it gives them some idea that how the work has been marked, and they can see that it's been marked fairly. Now the other thing you can do is, if you go to settings and feedback, you can actually define what you put in that report. So you might want to put percentages in there, for example. You might want to reduce some of the feedback that you're giving to students, because you might determine that too much information might confuse the students. But also you might want to put more detailed information there to give them more detailed feedback. So it's up to you to decide what you want to put in there, what your students and what you're happy with to put in that report. And you can define that from the select feedback for the report option. So that's basically how you use Ultramarker. The other thing that you can do is, if you click on Show Gen Assess in the settings, you'll see that it checks that box. Now when you go from Edit Criteria, you go into what we call Gen Assess mode. Now we can select a rubric. I can select a rubric template file, and this is actually the file. It gives me sort of placeholders, variable placeholders that I can use in a generic rubric here. And I then need to select my grade boundaries. My grade boundaries are A1 and A4 for my A grades. They're B1 and B3 for the boundary grades for each of my grades here. And once I've done that, I also might want to decide how I want to show up. So when I'm selecting what I'm going to show to students, I can also put whether it's a tick or a highlight or anything of that sort. Then what I can do is I can generate basically a populated rubric with feedback for my students. So I'm going to generate that, and then I'll save that. And I can close that. Then if I open that, I'll show you what it looks like. So I've got a tick in the box where I've decided each of those grades for each of the criterion, and I've got the feedback for each, and I can also show an overall grade for that as well. So this is the rubric that I can use I can output in a rubric format instead of a report format. So that might be useful for some people. Now I'm going to switch that off, so I don't need that. If I just want to show it as a report, I can just show it as a report. I'm going to clear this now. Another thing I can do with my assessment is I can actually add sub-criteria. So I wouldn't want to do that with that type of rubric though, but I can make this into hierarchical criteria. So for example, I can add sub-criteria 1, sub-criteria 2, and I've got a hierarchical criteria level. The other thing I might want to do is if I go to settings, I can select the criteria type. Now I can use checkboxes if I want to. Most people probably won't want to use checkboxes, but I can select whether those sub-criteria form part of the mark for the overall, for the each high-level criterion, or whether they're independent of the high-level criterion. In other words, each of these sub-criteria, do they form a part of the mark for this criterion, or are they separate? Are they a separate thing? So they all of the sub criteria and criteria add up to 100%. I guess what I do normally is I make, so for example, if this weighting for this criteria is 20%, my sub criteria I would weight at 50% each, for example, as an example. And in my settings for the criteria type, I would say no checkboxes. Weightings for the sub criteria are part of the weightings for the criteria. Okay, that's what I would define. So that's another thing you can do with this. You couldn't use the generate assess for that because it would be quite messy to do that. But you can generate a report from that when you're marking your students. Now another thing I can do, if I go to settings and select sessions, at the moment I'm using a single session, but I can select multiple sessions. So for example, if I'm doing lab work and I'm assessing student work every week or every other week, whatever I decide, and I've got multiple lab sessions. Now what I can do is I can use the same assessment criteria but amongst a number of different sessions. And you'll notice that this sessions tab appears when I select set multiple sessions in the settings. When I go to the sessions tab, I can then add sessions. So I'll give it a name like lab 1 and save that, and I'll add lab 2 and save that, and I can give it a description. I can also give it a weighting, so if I've got 10 sessions, each of those might be worth say 10%. And when I go back to my assessment, some buttons appear at the bottom and I can move between my sessions. So I can go between lab 1 and lab 2, for example. I can move between sessions. So that's if you want to use multiple sessions. If you don't, then switch the sessions to single sessions again, and that sessions tab will disappear. The other tabs you've got a peer review tab, and you can have a peer review template where you can fill this in so that to say that you've when you've developed a new assessment, it's been peer reviewed and signed off. The same thing when you've marked your students' work, that you can then get somebody else to moderate that work for you, and you can use a template also to agree that moderation process. The same thing with external examiners, or external moderator. The other tab you've got is a students tab. Now this enables you to import students from a comma-separated variable file. They will be the name of the student and then their email address. And that's what you can import when you're assessing those students. Those student names can be imported into here from that comma-separated variable. And that really explains, Ultramarker and the features, and how we've also looked at this example module here to help you to explain what you can do with Ultramarker. So it's up to you to sort of really to go through the example and then have a go at making your own assessment.